Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura DiNardis, Interim Dean of the School of Communication at American University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this very special and timely event, 12 days to the election. What could change, what probably won't. This is the debate before tonight's presidential debate, and I'm really looking forward to it. We are joined by election politics luminaries from the School of Communication and the School of Public Affairs at American University, including professors Candace Nelson, Leonard Steinhorn, and W. Joseph Campbell, as well as one of our great student leaders, Amrutha Chatty, the director of the Kennedy Political Union. And it will be moderated by our colleague Ron Elving, who I will introduce in a moment. What is the state of the election and what can we expect in the final days leading up to this historic election? These are the questions. Tonight will be part one of this discussion, and I want to invite you back to a follow-up on November 10th to reconvene and assess the outcome. So that will be every bit and possibly more interesting. Our program, as I mentioned, is moderated by distinguished journalist Ron Elving. He is the senior editor and correspondent on the Washington desk for NPR News, where he's frequently heard as a news analyst and writes regularly for npr.org. He is also a professorial lecturer and executive in residence in the School of Public Affairs right here at American University, where he has also taught in the School of Communication. He's an award-winning professor, having been honored with the University Faculty Award for outstanding teaching in an adjunct appointment. He previously worked for USA Today and for Congressional Quarterly, and is a prolific author, including his book, Conflict and Compromise, How Congress Makes the Law, which was published by Simon & Schuster. He will introduce the panel in the event. I just wanna, again, say thank you so much to all for joining us tonight. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. And now I will turn the program over to our moderator, Ron Elving.
Very much, Laura. And I want to say welcome to everyone who is joining us through the miracles of Zoom and the internet. I noticed that we have a registrant from Melbourne, Australia. Special greetings to you. We also have at least one from St. Petersburg, Russia. I won't speculate as to how many may also be joining us from Russia, but we do know we have one. And I want to welcome all of you, everyone, wherever you may be, to this particular panel on this unusually timely occasion. So it's a pleasure to be here with you. Our plan here is to have each of our four people present for a minimum really amount of time, because we only have 60 minutes total. So I'm going to ask them all to make a 5-minute presentation to begin, answer a question from one of their colleagues, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. We're going to reserve enough time, so there'll be 15 minutes or so at the end of the program so that we can also answer questions from you. And if you would, put those questions in the Q&A function on your Zoom meeting technology. You can also send notes in chat, but it's easier for me to just look in one central location and get your questions. And we're going to be taking your questions, as I say, toward the end of the program, and we'll be sorting through those, and I will choose the ones I think are most illustrative for everyone's interests. So to begin, I'm going to introduce W. Joseph Campbell, who is a professor of communication here in the School of Communication. He has written a number of books. I won't run through the entire list. Perhaps his most famous book is Getting It Wrong. He's had a couple of editions of that, which set the record straight about some of the most notorious and often misreported incidents in American journalism and American political journalism in particular. And he has most recently written a book called, you may have divined this already, Lost in a Gallop. And Joe's going to tell us a little bit about how polling leads us astray and how polling has been misreported and misunderstood and what that means to our political system. So, Professor Campbell.
Ron Elving, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that nice invitation or the introduction. And also my many thanks to my colleague, Dean Laura DiNardis, for her welcoming remarks. And also a quick thanks to Matt Seklecki, who is the SOC event planning manager who made this event tonight possible. So thank you all. And you're quite right, Ron. Polls do drive the narrative. They drive the news media's narrative, and they drive the popular understanding about the dynamics and the ebb and flow of political campaigns, particularly presidential election campaigns. And polls have a checkered record, quite frankly. Polls have been way off in the past, and polls sometimes have been very close to the actual outcome. Now, many pollsters will say that they're not into predictions, that they only offer a snapshot in time. But in many respects, that is a cop-out. Pollsters really do enjoy getting it right, and will tell you so if they are close, if their final estimates, if their final pre-election polls are very close to the outcome, they will crow about that a little. So pollsters are inclined to want to be correct in their predictions. And I'm not saying, and I don't say in the book Lost in a Gallup, that polls are always wrong, but they've been wrong often enough for us to be wary and for us to be skeptical about them, to treat them as important, but not as all decisive in terms of our understanding of the ebb and flow of the dynamics of a presidential election campaign. And polls, when they go wrong, can go wrong in different ways. They're not all these epic miscalls, such as the one that characterized the 1948 election between Dewey and Truman, when all the polls and all the pundits and the total news media thought that Thomas E. Dewey, the governor of New York, was going to win easily over President Harry Truman. Truman won that election in 1948 by 4.5 percentage points, an outcome that none of the polls anticipated. It was an epic polling collapse across the board. We've also seen more recently polling errors in key states in this country, such as in 2016, when Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan in particular, quite unexpectedly according to the polls and all the pundits, went for Donald Trump. And that trio of states was enough to tip the Electoral College and therefore the presidential election to Donald Trump. It was an outcome that was totally unexpected, and it was a total shock to the system. What are we looking at in 2020? Besides being wary about what the polls are signaling and being a little bit skeptical about what they may be showing us. As of tonight, as of this afternoon, late this afternoon, the Real Clear Politics aggregated average of national polls show that Joe Biden is ahead by 7.9 percentage points. It's a comfortable lead. It's a solid lead. It's a lead that I'm sure Donald Trump wished he had had. But the election isn't over. And the polls, these polls can still malfunction. They can still send off an erroneous message. And there are several potential scenarios that could still unfold that would throw off the outcome and would throw off the trajectory and would throw off the narrative, if you will, of the 2020 election campaign. We could, for example, see a late October surprise, a jarring, out of nowhere, completely unexpected moment that just scrambles the election and turns the election into a direction that we hadn't anticipated. And October surprises have happened often enough as to be almost expected. They're not predictable, of course, but they can be almost expected. And remember in 2016, 11 days before the election, about the same amount of time out from the election as we are right now, James Comey of the FBI announced that his agency had reopened its investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, which had the effect of scrambling her campaign and may have been enough. That announcement may have been enough to tip undecided voters to Donald Trump, and to do so in key states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and thereby tipping the election in Trump's favor. So an October surprise, a late October surprise, is one way in which the narrative could still be scrambled. Another way is that we see a reprise of 2016 in which key states, I've mentioned Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania a couple of times, they are again battleground states in this election, and that they could also show an erroneous final pre-election result, a pre-election result that is not confirmed by the voting, and that they tip the election to Donald Trump. It's still a possibility. So we could see a reprise of 2016. I don't think that's necessarily likely, because if the history of election polling tells us anything, it is that polling failure does not repeat itself. It does not repeat itself. So the most unlikely scenario that we could imagine is probably a reprise of 1948, when the polls are completely wrong across the board and point to the wrong winner. And I doubt that we'll see a reprise of 1948. But if the polls fail, they are likely to fail in some way that we have not anticipated and perhaps have never seen before. Ron, thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Professor. And I would like to turn now to, excuse me, Professor Steinhorn. And he is also a person with a lively interest in polls. He was a political consultant before he came to AU. He has worked for CBS. He has worked for many other broadcast outlets. And he is now professor of communication at American University. And I think this is an interest of yours too, is it not, Lenny? I mean, this is something that you have been writing about and talking about for a long period of time. Now, what I'd like to ask Professor Steinhorn to do at this point is to ask a question of Professor Campbell and have them have a little bit of exchange, and then I'd like to move on to our second presenter.
So thank you, Ron, and Laura, and everybody else involved in order, and welcome to everybody here. So Joe, you know, focusing on polls obviously is essential, but polls don't exist in a vacuum. Polls are part of a media ecosystem, and they help to drive what reporters think about, write about, where they visit, what they say. And as we both know, sometimes reporters end up in sort of a herd, writing about the same thing, pushing out the same storyline, pushing out the same narrative. So give us a little bit of sort of background on this sort of dynamic between polls and the media story, the media narrative, and how polls are influential in sort of leaving an impression with the public via the media about what's happening in a particular campaign.
That's exactly what happens, Lenny, is that the polls do set the narrative for the news media and in turn for the public. It's how we understand the dynamics and the ins and outs, the ebb and flow of election campaigns, particularly national campaigns, the presidential election campaign. And really, this is not a new development. This has been going on for perhaps 80 some years, since the quasi-scientific polling of George Gallup and Elmo Roper that was introduced in the mid-1930s, and they used it in the first presidential election. They used it was in the Roosevelt Alf Landon election of 1936. So we have been, at least since 1936, seeing how polls can set the narrative for the news media as well as for consumers and media audiences at large. And it is difficult to shake this, even though journalists often have said that we should try to do more of what is often called shoeleather journalism, to get out there, to get out of the office and to talk to people, you know, in their habitats, if you will, in their places of work and at their homes and everything. We should try to really get a sense of what people are talking about. Shoeleather journalism can be a complement to election polling, but it is not a replacement. We have seen this also over the years, that shoeleather journalism can be very impressionistic, and it can also be very misleading. And so there often is said to be no real good alternative to polling, as flawed as it may be. Now, I don't necessarily buy into that. There is the changes and shifts in registration, party registration, and sometimes those shifts in registration numbers can tell us a lot. And in some key states in 2020, we've seen that Republican registered voters have narrowed the gap between the difference between their voting and their registration and Democratic registrations. And that might tell us something too. They might tell us that there is going to be a closer election than many of the polls indicate. And in key battleground states, the polls are indeed indicating that the races are tighter than at the national level. The Real Clear Politics average this afternoon showed that Biden had a lead in the key battleground states of only about 4 percentage points. And that signals that we could be getting close to being within the margin of error for a polling surprise in 2020.
Absolutely. I'm going to break in there just because I need to move us along. We have another distinguished presenter I'd like to hear from at this point, and that is Professor Candace Nelson, who is a professor in the Department of Government and the academic director of the Campaign Management Institute in the School of Public Affairs. Until recently, was the chairman of the Department of Government and therefore my boss. And I must say, I have never had a more pleasant managerial relationship. It was a pleasure working for Candy. And she is the author of one of the books that I and many, many other people have used for many years, American Style Campaigns and Elections, American Style. It's now in its 5th edition, and my students eat it up. And I very much appreciate all the work that you and Professor Thurber did on that book over the years, and your other publications as well. But now I'd like to hear you tuck into this particular election.
Okay, well, thank you, Ron. I want to take a slightly different tack than my colleagues. I think many of us are skittish after what happened in 2016, and we thought we knew what the outcome was going to be, and many of us were wrong, Lenny being an exception. But I think things are trending towards Biden, and I think people are a little afraid to say that because, you know, as Professor Campbell just said, you know, in the battleground states, the polls tend to be all over the place. Some polls have Pennsylvania up by 10 or 12. People are a little skeptical of that. Michigan seems to be well outside the margin of error. People are a little skeptical of that. So we don't really know. We also have in play in this election states that weren't in 2016, Arizona being one, Georgia potentially being one. Maybe Texas, though I think that's probably a stretch. So I think Biden has a larger road to victory in the Electoral College than President Trump does. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Second, there's the Comey surprise, which said 11 days out in 2016. Maybe something will happen again, but if it doesn't, then maybe that's something for Biden. Third thing is we tend to see in many elections that undecided voters tend to break for the challenger. That happened in 2016. Among those who made their decision in October, slightly over 51% voted for Trump. Now, Hillary Clinton wasn't the incumbent, but I think one could make the argument that because she'd been in the Obama administration, she was part of that administration. If that happens this time, that could favor Joe Biden because he is the challenger. And the last thing I would mention is one of the things we talk about in communication and in political science is the importance of message. I think we could make the argument that Joe Biden has a pretty consistent message and he's stuck with it, even if he's been doing it from his basement. Whereas President Trump is all over the map. We'll see what happens tonight. Maybe he'll have more message discipline. But even if he does tonight in the debates, my guess is that won't last over the next 11 days. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ron, I guess. You're muted.
We're all still learning how to do this, right? At least remember how to do it again and again and again and again. So I'd like to introduce our 4th panelist, and that is Amrutha Chatty. She is the director of the she is a student rather in the School of Communications. She is the director of the Kennedy Political Union. So I asked her if it would be all right if I called her a union boss or a political boss or someone who had responsibility for a political machinery. And look, I mean, the KPU is about as benign an organization and beneficial and educational an institution as I've ever seen on a campus. And I want to just congratulate you on all the work that you've done and the union has done. And I'm sorry to make little jokes about the name. But in addition to your work with the KPU, you are also a senior in the School of Communication, studying public relations and strategic communication. And I must say, it grieves me that you're not in the journalism division, but we understand we have to share the talent. And who knows, over the long haul, you may take an interest in all forms of media. I hope you do. But would you like to ask a question at this point? Would you like to ask a question of Professor Nelson?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here with everybody today. Professor Nelson, you mentioned undecided voters, and this year, early voting, mail-in voting has been so big with almost 50 million Americans already casting their votes. How many undecided voters do you actually think that there are? And if any, do you think that the debates are actually going to be effective in swaying their minds?
There aren't many undecided voters. And so I don't think the debates will be very effective. But, if it's a really close election, maybe it'll affect some people. I think one of the things that's interesting is who those undecided voters might be. And I think they may be Obama-Trump voters. So I think we just don't know. In terms of early vote, mail-in voting, one of the things we saw in 2016 is many of the people that voted, there was a lot of excitement among the Clinton campaign that there was so much early voting among who they thought were their supporters. But how it turned out was the people that were voting early were just voting early because it was more convenient and otherwise would have voted on election day. It's hard to know if that's happening in this election, but my guess is that some of it, but not all of it, just because there are so many more people voting early. Maybe it's because of COVID, but the percentages, they're 200% in some states, higher than they were in 2016. So I think that may tell us something.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. That is certainly one of the great unknowns. We have seen such extraordinary interest in voting early, obviously because of the pandemic, but also because I think people, are just eager to have their say. I've talked to, I don't know how many people who aren't particularly worried about going to the polls, but just can't wait to slam their vote through that slot in the pickup box. So thank you for your question, Amrutha. We'll come back to you in just a few minutes for your presentation. But now I would like to turn to Professor Steinhorn and hear a little bit about, when you've got a predictive record like you have, people are bound to be on tenterhooks to hear what you think this time.
So I think it was the great baseball player Yogi Berra who once said, "I never make predictions, especially about the future." But I want to play off a little bit about on what Joe was saying with the polls. And obviously, the polls are very valuable, very important, and very good, smart people apply scientific methods to be able to get these numbers, notwithstanding the fact that we do have a margin of statistical error that always should be highlighted in almost every poll that's reported, as well as the old phrase among pollsters that they have a 95% confidence that a poll will be accurate if that entire population were surveyed altogether. So again, as I always say to my students, I'm not so sure I would jump out of a building based on a 95% accuracy, but we all have to keep that in mind, that polls, we fetishize numbers, but there are sort of built-in uncertainties into every poll, and polls don't vote, people do, and their votes have to count. But along the lines of the narrative that we are hearing, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Joe Biden should win this election. And probably the biggest factor to think about is that there are no third-party candidates this year. Very, very important. Hillary Clinton lost Michigan by 11,000 votes in 2016, but Gary Johnson and Jill Stein got 224,000 votes collectively between the two of them. Clinton lost Wisconsin by 22,000 votes in 2016, but Johnson and Stein got collectively 138,000 votes. And Clinton lost Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes, but Johnson and Stein collectively got 197,000 votes. So that alone could be a decisive factor in this election. Also, you saw a dip in African-American turnout in those three key battleground states, a sense of lack of enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton, also moving to voting third party, as well as opting out and not voting altogether. Will that change this year? Some evidence suggests it will. You see suburban women, that whole sort of hemorrhaging from the Republican Party of suburban women moving toward the Democratic Party. I'm not sure the Democrats have sealed the deal to make all of these folks say, I'm a Democrat. But what I think is happening is they're now saying, I'm not a Republican and I'm not a Trump supporter. And as goes suburban women, could it mean that their spouses or friends go as well? And will that mean some movement among suburban men who feel that they have to conform to their community norm, which is definitely sort of oppositional to Donald Trump? We're also seeing some numbers among senior citizens that the big margin that Donald Trump held in 2016 may evaporate or come a lot closer. If that's the case, it could have a big impact, particularly in Florida, but also remember that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are older skewing states. And so you end up with, if the margin between seniors is smaller in those states, it could have an impact. Also, the margin among Catholics in 2016 was fairly large, white Catholics. That may be narrowing, Joe Biden potentially being only the second Catholic president of the United States. And then the wild card is Amrutha's generation, young people, who are the most liberal and socially inclusive generation in our history. The question is whether their values will translate into votes and the level at which they will turn out. In 2018, you did have a pretty good turnout of young people. Whether that increases proportionately in a presidential year could be the difference between Joe Biden winning some of these states and Donald Trump not. But as every professor always says, with that word but, there's always a caveat. Let's keep in mind that President Trump is playing with the sort of electoral equivalent of House money. He accumulated 306 electoral college votes in 2016, which means he has 36 electoral college votes to lose. He could lose all of those 36 and still be reelected. Then we go to those national polls, which seem to captivate so many people. But if you subtract Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, and Manhattan from the 2016 popular vote, Donald Trump would have won the popular vote in the United States. Plus, in all of these national polls, you will see Joe Biden running up big numbers in California with their 40 million residents, 20 million or so voters, big margins in New York, big margins in Illinois and New Jersey. In all of those other big states, there is a very small margin. Florida is going to be tight. Texas for this year may be tight. Ohio will be tight. Pennsylvania will be tight. So the big states will give Joe Biden an advantage in the national polls that may not be reflected in the battlegrounds. Plus, there's that other factor. Are there some shy Trump voters who choose not to give their opinions to pollsters? There was a study done earlier this year which said 11.7% of Republicans say they are hesitant to share their views and opinions when surveyed on the phone. So could that translate to some sort of skewing of these polling numbers? And then there's the enthusiasm advantage that Donald Trump has, which is bigger than Joe Biden. He seems to be also trying to reach out to African-American men whose numbers in support of the Democratic candidate have been declining to the point that Hillary Clinton only got 80% of African-American men in 2016. And Latino Catholics, he's also pushing out ads to them. And then, as Joe mentioned, there's that registration surge among Republicans in key states. The Trump campaign learned in 2016 that there were 2.4 million eligible whites without college degrees who didn't vote in Pennsylvania, 2.2 million in Florida, 1.6 million in Michigan, almost 900,000 in Wisconsin. And they've been doing everything they can to register those voters. And one other point that's worth noting. In September, NPR did an analysis that said that up until that time, with the primaries, 500,000 mail ballots were rejected for arriving too late, missing signatures, or other errors. So even if you have a surge of young people and mail-in ballots doing it that way, could a disproportionate number be rejected? And we're already seeing evidence that among younger people and African Americans, those mail-in ballots are being rejected at higher numbers. Put all of that together, and what you have with Donald Trump with his electoral college house money, can lose 36 electoral college votes. He can win any number of states and surprise some of these polls by razor thin margins and pull off another 2016. Is it likely? I'm not sure, because I think some of the circumstances do advantage Joe Biden. Is it possible? Absolutely, yes.
All right. Candy, a question for Lenny.
So Lenny, we have the debate in about 3.5 hours, I guess. What do you expect to come out of that? What do you think each candidate's sort of goal is going into the debate, coming out of the debate in terms of messaging, demeanor?
So it's funny, we talked about this in our class earlier today, and that mute button. It will mute the sound for all of us watching on television, but that doesn't mean that Donald Trump, if he so chooses, will be silent on stage. In fact, if he speaks out on stage, we might not hear his interruptions, but Joe Biden certainly will, and the moderator certainly will. So it will be interesting to see how this mute button plays out, and whether President Trump, realizing that he can still talk over Joe Biden or put in these comments and remarks to try and trip up Joe Biden, and we're not going to hear it, which means we may not think he's interrupting as much as he did interrupt in the previous debate. So I'll really be curious how that plays out. But here's the bottom line. Donald Trump, he has one key goal, and that's to throw Joe Biden off balance and to get Joe Biden to commit some sort of big gaffe or big mistake, and to plant seeds of doubt about Joe Biden as a potential leader and potential president. Because even though there are just a small number of undecided voters in this country, let's say, for argument's sake, it's only 4%. That's still 6 million voters, and distributed potentially across those battleground states could make up the difference, given those small margins that we saw in those battleground states in 2016. So I think Donald Trump is going to basically try and charge up his base, but his goal is to try and keep Joe Biden off balance. I think he tried that in the last debate. He didn't succeed. Let's see if he comes in with a kinder, gentler strategy to the camera, but a real sort of fully armed to go after Joe Biden on issues related to Joe Biden's son, Hunter, and any other issues that he may push on this. So I think that'll be Trump's strategy. Joe Biden is going to have to keep his cool. He's going to have to show his vision. He's going to have to articulate his policies. He's going to have to answer that question on the Supreme Court to the satisfaction of the chattering classes. And he's going to have to do something that will excite his base in the Democratic Party, but also reassure moderates that he's going to have a consensus problem-solving administration, not built around any sort of left-wing ideology, which is exactly the attack that Donald Trump will try to level against him.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. And now, Amrutha Chatty, we would like to hear your presentation, and then there'll be a question for you.
Sure. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about the work that, the Kennedy Political Union has been doing this semester. The Kennedy Political Union, for those who don't know, is American University's student-run nonpartisan speakers bureau. We've been on campus for over 50 years now, bringing various members to speak to our students, whether it be public officials or we've brought actors, activists, really anybody. And so this semester has been very interesting because when it falls into an election year, it's really hard to hone in on that nonpartisan aspect of KPU because elections tend to be the most partisan times that we have. And I think in an election as polarizing as this one, we've really struggled to find where the balance is in talking about things from both sides, because it seems to be that there's only one side of issues that has facts, that has truth, and that students want to hear, really. So that's become an interesting hurdle. We decided to solve that by really tackling issues rather than sides. So when we talk about nonpartisan, we're trying not to be bipartisan. We're just trying to talk about what are the things that are being talked about in this campaign. For example, we hosted, in partnership with the Women's Initiative and the Student Union Board, a series on Black Lives Matter where we hosted 2 keynote speakers and did smaller events. We hosted Dr. Fauci to talk about COVID-19. So we're really trying to get perspectives about what the issues are that are driving this campaign, rather than partisan people coming in to talk about their aspects of being part of this election. But I do want to quickly touch on what Professor Steinhorn was talking about in, where my generation is and how and if we're going to show up to the polls. And I think it's really interesting that, he mentioned the enthusiasm problem. And I think that is a huge one that Joe Biden faces in communicating with the younger generation. I guess I'm the spokesperson here for all of us. But I think something huge that he is having to reckon with is this issue of progressive gatekeeping. a lot of young people wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders if they were able to vote. A lot of young people did vote for whether it was Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, more progressive people during the primaries. And Joe Biden is running into the issue of progressives who don't want to settle for his more moderate policies. What's interesting is that Joe Biden is actually running on one of the most progressive platforms maybe ever, but young people have this idea, and it's an idea that Biden has not done much to quash, that he is a very moderate candidate. And because of that, it's an interesting take that, Trump is trying to attack him for being far left, where the progressives on the far left aren't feeling that at all. In fact, things like his climate change plan, their stance on fracking, which is, very obviously something he has to say to win over Pennsylvania voters. Those are things that are really turning off younger voters. So I think, while there is a lot of push for people to vote blue, for people to vote against Donald Trump, it'll be interesting to see if we can get 2018 type turnout numbers, because young people might have been voting for more progressive people directly in 2018, rather than voting for the Democratic Party as a whole, voting as a referendum. It seems to be on the platform of the Democratic Party. So I think that'll be interesting to see whether young people are, one, able to learn how to vote, like Professor Steinhorn mentioned, with the issues of mail-in voting and votes not counting, but two, to see if they even want to, because while we are very progressive, sometimes it doesn't mean that we're willing to settle for folks who don't share our exact values.
Thank you, Amrutha. I think Generation Z is very well represented. Joe Campbell, do you have a question?
Sure do. Thanks, Ron. Amrutha, your KPU does terrific work and has done it for 50 years, and it's a real asset to the campus. I'm curious to know whether you or your colleagues have picked up on any evidence that there is a shy Trump contingent of voters out there. We've talked about that a little bit tonight. It's much discussed in the press and among pollsters. There seems to be a considerable amount of doubt that there is a shy Trump contingent reservoir of voters that are just waiting for the opportunity to vote Donald Trump back into office. And a related question, do you detect much reservations among your cohort about voting for one of two septuagenarians? Trump and Biden are both pretty old guys.
Yeah, definitely. I think, to the first question, I think that especially young people, if they are Trump supporters, are very hesitant to say so. We looked at a polling class the other day about young people who feel more than comfortable calling out their friends if they don't share the exact same political views or values. I personally know people who will not tell me if they are Republicans, if they disagree with, any liberal or democratic views on things. So I think, young people at least are definitely shy Trump supporters. I don't know how many of them there are. Maybe we can't get a good image because they won't say that they are who they are. But I think that definitely is a reality, because especially among young people, because the vast majority of people are so progressive, it becomes harder for people to speak out. What I'll also say is, especially in our student organizations, working with organizations on both sides of the spectrum has been an interesting challenge. Like I said, we are nonpartisan, but it seems to be easier to work with more liberal leading organizations because there seem to be more options of people who want to come speak, who people are willing to listen to. Whereas on the other side, the right side of the aisle, there's not a lot of speakers that we can go to that either the campus wants to hear from or that student organizations want to be associated with, whether or not they actually agree with the policies or the views. So it's an interesting scenario because we don't know how many of them there are, and we may never get a good picture, but that definitely is a situation that is taking place. But I think to your second question, I think, what's interesting about it is people have been more willing to attack Joe Biden for his age, but the same people who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. So it's a very interesting dichotomy there, because it seems to be, the attacks on Joe Biden's age seem to be coming more from this distaste for the establishment and what Joe Biden represents as being a politician for so long and being, somebody who's had maybe not the best record for young people. We talk about the 1984 crime bill, something that's come up many, many times, at least, from what I can see on Twitter, is his behavior with Anita Hill. Moments like that, I think, are what more plagued Joe Biden, less about the actual number of his age and more, the experiences that he's had in politics because of how long he's been there. So I think it more comes from a distrust of just entirely the establishment and what young people feel about that.
That's all very interesting. I'd just like to throw this open and say, this is the time for all those of you who are still with us on the call, and I'm seeing a very large number here among participants, but I'm not seeing a lot of questions yet. So if you do have questions, if you want to enter the conversation, this is your opportunity. Go ahead and register your questions. Amrutha, one of the things we've been doing in public affairs is we've literally been asking our classes, either as an assignment or as an addendum to a midterm or a quiz, tell us what is your plan for voting. We've been asking people to tell us. I can't remember ever doing that before in as teaching or just in any kind of organized way, putting an onus on students to, not necessarily be graded on their plan, but just to have one, to tell us that they are serious enough about voting to actually know how they're going to do it. They've asked for their absentee ballot. They've actually already turned it in, things of that nature. Do you have a sense, and I realize AU is the most politically active campus in America, et cetera, but do you have a sense that perhaps beyond the AU campus, in your wider acquaintance, that this is really a game change situation for Gen Z voters?
Yeah, I think, what's really interesting is when we talk about 2018 as this huge turnout for youth voters, people who I am friends with outside of like the political atmosphere of AU didn't vote and didn't even know that there was a surge, weren't even sure that there was an election. But I think, I live at home right now. I'm doing this semester from New Jersey. And so it's been a lot easier for me to communicate with folks who go to schools like Rutgers, who maybe aren't as politically active. And they have actually all been registering to vote. I know one of my best friends, she's never been involved in politics before, and she registered her entire friend group and they all voted together. It really has been a big game changer. And I think it's really exciting. Maybe it is, because it is just a presidential is the biggest draw because it just naturally catches so much more attention in the media. But I think it more so has to do with, how politics has almost become pop culture. And if you're missing out on things happening in the political world, you're missing out on what's going on Twitter, on why everyone's Instagram stories are a certain way, or you won't get the jokes on SNL or Trevor Noah or whatever it might be. So I think it's been interesting to see. I'm hoping that, my best friend and her little friend group is not an anomaly. I'm hoping that's happening all over the country. But I do think, at least I personally have noticed that people who have been apolitical before are starting to step in for this cycle.
Thank you. Thank you for that. One question that we have received thus far is asking to what degree any of the panelists are taking seriously, because obviously many people are taking seriously, the implication that with all of the different methods we have now of voting and much, much greater mail-in voting, the implication of potential fraud. How seriously do we take the threat that this election is going to be in some sense or another corrupted by all the people voting by non-conventional, or at least a far greater number of people voting by mail?
I'll take the first stab at that. We don't have much evidence in this country that there is fraud. That's the first thing. Second, we have a number of states that have had vote by mail for years, and that works fine. There are no problems out there either. So, maybe it might be different this year, but I don't think there's any evidence that we should expect large-scale fraud because of mail-in voting.
I think the operative word is Candy is saying it's not fraud because we don't have evidence of voter fraud historically. George W. Bush had a commission that showed very little voter fraud in this country. The President Trump's commission couldn't even come up with any conclusions based on that. The more operative word is chaos. Chaos in the counting, with chaos in the mail system. Will vote ballots come in late? There are some states that will allow ballots to come in after Election Day if they're postmarked by Election Day, other states that won't. We're seeing slowdowns in the mail service where there's some evidence that any sort of 25 to 30% of mail is not arriving on time and coming in late in certain battleground states. And so it's the chaos that's worrisome. the sheer number of votes, the need in some states to be able to match signatures, the secrecy envelopes that people may forget to put on their votes and therefore discounting some of their votes. And in other states, there are some states where you actually have to have a witness sign that they sort of validate the fact that you're actually who you are and that you're voting on this. So there may be big potential for chaos based on the sheer number of mail-in votes that come in, unlike anything we've seen. And are these states ready to deal with it? We've seen in some of these primaries where some states, it was total chaos. New York State, Pennsylvania, elsewhere. And so this is the problem that we're facing right now, is the chaos. And then on top of that, people who hear that message and want their vote to count, they may show up in certain states that have limited the number of polling places, particularly in minority areas. And we may see long, long lines, to the point that people we've seen in primaries have been online for up to 7 or 8 hours waiting to cast their vote. So this is what worries me more than any fraud, because every single mail-in ballot has a barcode, and it will be really hard for fraud to take place when you've got these barcodes and you've got all these security measures put in place. So as Candy said, states that have done it, Oregon, Washington, virtually no fraud. It's done right. They don't have a problem with that, but it's the chaos we have to watch out for.
Yes, and of course, the president would not be inclined to call it chaos. He would be inclined to call it fraud if he were finding something to object to. He had not been necessarily obviously reelected, and he had something to object to. By the way, that question came to us from Kosovo, from a person who is an election observer there with Democracy Volunteers. And we also have other questions from a number of other countries, including one question here from Great Britain. And the question is, and I'll toss this one to you, Joe, have the pollsters done things to address the specific problems of 2016, whether it's the shy Trumper problem or the unrepresentativeness, the oversampling of college-educated suburbanites and so forth that Tom Edsel and some other people have detected in, there are a number of studies that found that after the 2016 vote, especially in terms of the exit polls and things of that nature.
There have been efforts to correct what appear to have been problems with the 2016 polling. And one of the big problems in key battleground states, again, those 3 states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are key in this regard, is that the pollsters effectively undersampled or underweighted for non-college voters, white voters without a 4-year college degree, who went for Donald Trump in great numbers. And that was a key conclusion of a report prepared in early 2017 by the American Association for Public Opinion Research, the continent's largest public opinion research organization. However, not all pollsters buy into that theory that undersampling or underrepresenting or not waiting for non-college voters, white voters, made that much of a difference. So there's, in polling, there are an awful lot of peculiarities and a lot of ways in which polls can be contaminated. And even if years later, pollsters still dispute as to what exactly went wrong with a particular election. And so in 2016, that is not entirely endorsed by all the pollsters. Another feature is this supposed phenomenon of the shy Trump voter. Now, most pollsters have doubts as to whether there is a shy Trump contingent, a cohort of shy Trump voters who, for social desirability reasons, do not express their true feelings and their true beliefs and their true preferences. And it's unlikely that they exist in large enough numbers to tip an election, to tip the national election, or even in key battleground states. But if pollsters are not getting honest answers about voters' intentions, then it's very hard for the pollsters to get it right.
Yes.
And so a shy Trump contingent or cohort, if it exists, and I have my doubts about whether it exists, but there is enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that it might, and that there will be a large turnout of Trump voters on election day or in the run-up to election day, whom the pollsters failed to tap, failed to gauge accurately. And if that's the case, we could be looking at a real wild card in this election. But and another factor that suggests there might be a shy Trump phenomenon is that Trump outperformed his polls particularly in key states, and particularly those battleground states that we've mentioned several times tonight. And he might do it again. He just might.
Well, that's going to be one of the main headlines on the day after the election, if the president does, for example, carry Pennsylvania, because there doesn't seem to be much reason for him to think he's going to, unless you believe that the polls are simply wrong. We have several questions here from people who are concerned about the hacking issue. And by that, I mean the foreign interference issue. Just today, we have the current director of national intelligence coming out talking about Iranians who are selling false narratives and harassing Democratic voters. We, of course, have also heard from other federal agencies about the ongoing efforts, particularly ramping up in September by Russian agencies, the same folks, presumably, who came after us in 2016 in a variety of ways on social media, and then in attempts, at least, to hack computers that were voter registration computers, voter counting computers. Not a lot of evidence that actually took place, but a lot of evidence that they managed to get into the conversation through social media. How concerned are you, Candace, about the levels of that we're seeing right now?
Well, the reports seem to suggest that may be going on. I think it's hard to know, but there's not a whole lot we can do about that. So I think what we have to do instead is encourage everyone to get out and vote, however they choose to vote. And it's hard to hack into a national election because our elections are so localized. The machines are so localized. People that are voting by mail are voting from their homes. They're filling out their ballots in their homes. So it's, in our country, it's just hard to do, but that's not to say it's not happening. And I think the bigger concern is not hacking into actual votes, but trying to influence how people vote in terms of what's out there, particularly on social media.
Yes, we saw Facebook in 2008, then of course Twitter in 2016 seemed to make a tremendous amount of difference in creating the narrative around the election and creating the sense of groundswell.
Ron, if I may, just very briefly, I really have my doubts about the power and persuasive value of these kinds of efforts on social media. I mean, it takes a lot to change people's minds, and the exposure to unwanted messaging on social media is perhaps a factor, but I think it's a very small factor, because if the history of media theory and media effects tells us anything, is that it is very difficult to change people's minds, and social media platforms and messaging is just one of many, many ways in which people make up their minds about a candidate or an election.
But do you assume that it's necessarily unwanted? I mean, aren't these people who are providing all kinds of ammunition or fuel for people who are looking for it, and in that sense pushing the narrative?
I have my doubts in general about the whole Russia narrative, and I just don't see that this is going to make that much of a difference. If it does prove to be effective, it's going to be only in a small scale, small bore kind of way.
All right. There is a question that we've been receiving that I want to try to get to before we run out of time. But Lenny, I know you had an interest in getting in on that last conversation.
Yeah, I mean, so on this particular item, if you actually look at what happened in 2016, there was very granular targeting, not only on the part of the Russians, but also the Trump campaign aimed at African-American voters in some of these battleground states. Now, it may not have changed people's minds per se, but it may have helped spin out a certain narrative that gave people permission not to vote for Hillary Clinton or not to vote overall in that period of time. So insofar, Joe, you're right, it's not going to persuade somebody, but the accumulation of information that they received, some of it really nefarious, coming up with sort of fake names of Black Power groups aimed at the African-American community, talking about Hillary Clinton and her comment in the 90s about super predators and so on. That may have made a difference. We don't know how big a difference, but because the margins are so small, if enough people opted out and there were enough messaging to be able to get them to opt out, that could have made a difference. So I don't think it completely transformed the election, but if they work enough at the margins, that could be effective. And again, it's not just the Russians. The Trump campaign with their Cambridge Analytica information, there was a study done by Britain's Channel 4, which detailed how they went at the most granular level, neighborhood by neighborhood, and you actually saw with the precise targeting they did, declining numbers of people who actually went out to vote that year compared to previous years. So,
right, and as you pointed out, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Milwaukee, decreased numbers of black votes in those three cities obviously cost Hillary Clinton those three states. I want to get Amrutha in the conversation here, and I had a question from our audience that I thought would be a good one for you to address. How much difference is it making to the students that they're not on campus in many cases, or in few cases? They're back home, they're possibly voting in a different place. Maybe they're voting, well, what difference is it making in your observation?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting change between elections. The students are finally at home. I know I've personally had issues getting my ballot on campus and sending my ballot back. A lot of states have great trackers that I've been able to use in New Jersey, where you can see if your ballot's been received, if it's been accepted. I think being at home is going to be really strong in helping student turnout. For one, if I know a lot of states are sending out mail-in ballots to every registered voter. So that's a really great way for people to even just be encouraged to vote. It could also prevent some of these mistakes that we've been talking about in ballots with secrecy envelopes, signatures, things like that. If you're voting at the same time as your parents, if you're voting at the same time as people in your household, you might have people who are preventing you from making those mistakes. So I think that's really important. But I also think where you're going to see things increase a lot are actually in swing states, because students are now able to vote at home in states where maybe mail-in voting, is not as reliable. I know friends who live in Pennsylvania don't trust the mail-in ballot system. So they're able to vote either in person, turn in their ballots straight to a county office, things like that. People are taking those extra steps now that they have the opportunities to. So I think it'll definitely make a big difference. I know we're hearing a lot of make your plan to vote from the AU community. I hope that's happening across other campuses as well. But I think, having students at home for the first time is going to really drive up people who at least are doing their best to try and make their vote count.
Yes, absolutely. And certainly would probably make more difference in their home state than it would in the District of Columbia. So Matt, do we have enough time for each person to have a final word?
Yes, go right ahead.
All right, that's great. Well, then let us do that. Candy, I'll ask you to lead off if you would.
Yeah, I think, again, leading into the debate tonight, I think we want to look at what each candidate's message is and how that plays going into the final 11 days of the election.
All right, and indeed we will. I'm sure we'll all be watching. Professor Campbell.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks again for a fine job of moderating tonight, and thanks to Dean Laura DeNardis for setting the tone. I think we should be mindful that the polls have been wrong in the past, and this is not a done deal yet. This election could still change. It could still turn on these key battleground states, and those margins in the polling in those states look very tight compared to the national margins.
Absolutely, Professor Stein.
Well, this election may be over on November 3rd or November 15th or November 20th or who knows when. Presumably, we will have somebody inaugurated on January 20th. But even once a new president takes place or the current president takes the oath of office for his second term and the election is over, we have some serious questions about our democracy and our democratic institutions that we have to focus on. So insofar as all of the attention right now is on who will win and who will prevail, I think we just can't take our foot off the gas pedal and say, okay, election's over, we'll go on with things and go on with life in America. We have serious questions about our democracy, about our voting, about the role of the media and confidence in the media, about our political parties, about polarization, about how people use and acquire power in this country. And if we don't begin to answer those, then my generation, as we talked about in class today, will not be handing off something good to Amrutha's generation.
Amrutha, what are your hopes and dreams? What are you hoping? What are you hoping we can deliver to you, and what are you offering us?
I mean, big hopes and dreams from our generation, I think. But I think the first thing we're going to have to address, like Professor Steinhorn said, is even if Biden ends up winning this election, these thoughts, these people, these ideas are not disappearing the second after the election is called for him. So there are some serious conversations that we need to have. I don't think our generation is going to be satisfied even when Biden wins. We're hoping to keep pushing the envelope further, hoping to make bigger, broader changes to the system as a whole. I think, either way that this goes, we have serious conversations to have about, the future that my generation wants and how we can achieve those goals. So I think, the election is definitely a start to what I hope is a new version of our system where we can erase some of the issues that have come up over the past few decades.
Thank you very much for that. I think that's exactly how we'd like to conclude. Do we have someone to give us a benediction, or do we simply go off into the Zoom ether and disappear? Well, for those of you who are still with us, and I see that our participants have really hung in there, and that's great. I thank you for all your questions. Tried to get to as many as possible. And I definitely want to thank all of our panelists for all of their caring and all of the passion and all of the work that you have brought to your consideration of elections over your careers. And Amrutha, welcome to the field of people obsessively interested in American politics.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.